It was a quiet evening in Colorado Springs when a single gunshot shattered the silence, leaving a man dead and a community in shock. Matt, a successful and well-liked figure in town, was killed by his best friend Scott in a sudden act of violence. The reason? An affair between Matt and Scott's wife, Emily, a secret relationship that had been simmering for months. How did a lifelong friendship end in murder? What pushed Scott, a man who had kept his jealousy hidden for years, to take such drastic action? In the small town of Colorado Springs, Scott Adams, a dedicated but struggling retail manager, lived a life marked by deep devotion to his wife, Emily. His love for her was intense, almost bordering on obsession. Emily, with her natural beauty, intelligence, and warm personality, had a way of drawing people in. She was kind and caring, the type of woman who lit up a room without trying. Scott adored her for these qualities, seeing her as the center of his world. To him, Emily was more than just a wife. She was his reason for living. Scott and Emily Adams seemed to have the kind of marriage that others admired. Living in the quiet town of Colorado Springs, they were seen as a loving couple, deeply committed to each other. But beneath this picture-perfect surface, their marriage was far from unshakable. Scott, though he loved Emily deeply, carried a weight that he never fully expressed. His lifelong feelings of inadequacy were a constant source of pain. While Emily loved him for who he was, Scott often felt like he wasn't enough. And that feeling only grew stronger whenever he compared himself to Matt, his best friend. Scott and Matt's friendship began in the early years of their childhood. Growing up in the same small town of Colorado Springs, they were inseparable, always playing together and sharing in the adventures of youth. But from the beginning, their lives were set on different paths. Matt's family was wealthy, living in a large, beautiful house on the nicer side of town. He always had the best toys, the newest clothes, and the opportunities that Scott could only dream of. Scott, on the other hand, came from a more modest background. His family got by, but they didn't have the luxuries that Matt's family enjoyed. As they grew older, the differences between them became even more obvious. Matt excelled in school, was popular with both teachers and classmates, and seemed to have everything fall into place for him. He was handsome and outgoing, the kind of person who could walk into a room and instantly become the center of attention. To many, Matt represented everything they wished they could be: successful, charming, and well-liked. He had a successful career, was well-connected in the community, and seemed to know exactly how to win people over. Matt's ability to command attention wasn't just because of his good looks. It was his personality that truly set him apart. He had a way of making everyone feel special, like they were the only person in the room when he spoke to them. People were drawn to him, not just for his looks, but for his natural charm. He had an easy smile, knew how to make people laugh, and seemed to glide through life without a care in the world. Wherever Matt went, admiration followed. But this very quality, the one that made Matt so beloved by the community, was also what made him a threat to Scott. While Scott kept his feelings of jealousy hidden, they intensified whenever Matt was around. To Scott, Matt was a constant reminder of everything he lacked. And when Matt's charm eventually won over Emily, it wasn't just another blow to Scott's self-esteem, it was the final betrayal. Scott always felt like he was playing catch-up. He was quieter, less confident, and often struggled to stand out. While he worked hard, his achievements never seemed to measure up to Matt's. Where Matt seemed to succeed effortlessly, Scott often felt like he was invisible. Even when he did well, it was hard for him to enjoy his success because Matt's shadow loomed so large. And though Matt never flaunted his good fortune, or made Scott feel small on purpose, Scott couldn't help but notice how much more Matt had, whether it was in wealth, looks, or attention from others. Despite this, Scott never confronted Matt about his feelings of jealousy. He kept them bottled up, choosing instead to remain a loyal friend. Over time, however, these feelings of envy began to fester. Scott never told Emily about the depth of his insecurities. He hid his jealousy well, burying it beneath layers of devotion and love. But those feelings were always there, simmering just below the surface. He feared that Emily, who was everything he wasn't, charming, beautiful, and easy to love, might one day see him the way he saw himself, as less than Matt. This fear slowly began to poison their marriage. This unspoken tension began to strain their relationship. Emily felt as though she was walking on eggshells, afraid that any wrong move might deepen Scott's fears. Scott, meanwhile, became more withdrawn, silently battling his feelings of jealousy and self-doubt. Though they still functioned as a couple on the surface, sharing their daily lives and routines, the emotional bond between them was beginning to crack. What had once been a marriage built on love and trust was slowly being undermined by Scott's insecurities and the silent comparison he made between himself and Matt. From Emily's perspective, things were not so black and white. She genuinely loved Scott for his loyalty and the tenderness he showed her. His quieter nature had drawn her in, and she had seen a depth in him that others often missed. But over time, she began to sense the unspoken distance growing between them. Scott's increasing jealousy, his need for constant reassurance, and his silence about his feelings left her feeling more and more disconnected. Though she never stopped caring for him, there were moments when she felt stifled by his insecurity, unsure of how to bridge the emotional gap that was forming between them. Emily had always found Matt charming. Everyone did. But up until recently, her feelings for him had remained harmless. She loved her husband, Scott, and believed in their marriage, even as things grew more complicated between them. As the emotional distance between Emily and Scott widened, however, she found herself feeling more isolated. Scott's jealousy, which had always been there, was starting to affect their relationship in ways that neither of them could ignore. He had become more withdrawn, often lost in his own thoughts, struggling with his insecurities. Emily, meanwhile, was feeling lonely. She missed the emotional connection they once had. While she still cared deeply for Scott, the warmth and affection that had once defined their marriage seemed to be slipping away. She began to feel trapped in the growing silence between them. It was during this vulnerable time that Matt started coming around more often. Scott and Matt had been best friends for years, and Matt was a regular presence in their lives. When Scott wasn't around, Matt's natural charm felt even stronger. His compliments made her feel appreciated in a way she hadn't felt for a long time. And slowly, Emily found herself drawn to him. At first, it was innocent enough, just light flirting and casual conversations. But that small spark of attraction quickly grew. Emily didn't set out to betray Scott, but she couldn't ignore the excitement she felt whenever Matt was around. He made her feel alive, seen, and valued in a way that Scott, struggling with his own insecurities, hadn't been able to in months. One day, when Scott wasn't home, Matt came over, and what had been building between them for weeks finally tipped over. They kissed, and from that moment, things escalated quickly. The affair began as a whirlwind of emotions, secret meetings, stolen moments, and a sense of passion that Emily hadn't felt in years. For the next 2 months, Emily and Matt kept their relationship hidden from Scott. They met at Matt's house when Scott was at work, carefully hiding their tracks to avoid suspicion. But even as the affair intensified, guilt began to weigh heavily on Emily. She knew what she was doing was wrong. She knew she was betraying her husband, a man who loved her deeply. Yet the pull of her attraction to Matt, mixed with her feelings of loneliness and frustration, kept her locked in this secret relationship. Emily felt torn. Every time she looked at Scott, her guilt grew, but somehow, she couldn't stop seeing Matt. The secrecy was exhausting, but it also made the affair feel more exciting. She convinced herself that she could keep both lives separate, that her relationship with Matt could remain in the shadows while she continued to live her life with Scott. Neither Matt nor Emily seemed fully aware of how much Scott suspected. But the truth was, Scott's jealousy had already begun to tear at him long before the affair started. By the time Emily and Matt were meeting in secret, Scott's intuition had already kicked in. The storm was brewing. even though neither Emily nor Matt could see it coming. They were too caught up in the secrecy, too wrapped in their guilt and desire to realize that the spark between them had already ignited an inferno that was about to consume them all. The affair, for both of them, was more than just a betrayal. For Emily, it was a brief escape from the emotional distance in her marriage. For Matt, it may have been another way to assert his dominance, even over his best friend. But for Scott, who loved his wife more than anything, it would be the final blow, one he could never recover from. It was an ordinary evening when Scott's life took a sudden, dark turn. He and Emily were having dinner at home, a quiet meal like so many others they had shared over the years. They spoke little as the distance between them had grown familiar, but Scott still loved her deeply, even if he couldn't express it. As Emily got up to refill her glass of water, she left her phone on the table. It buzzed with a message, and Scott, almost out of instinct, glanced at the screen. What he saw stopped him cold. A flirtatious message from Matt, his best friend. In that instant, a flood of emotions hit him: shock, confusion, anger, but most of all, suspicion. Could this message be innocent? He wanted to believe it was, but his gut told him otherwise. Scott's mind raced as he tried to recall moments, little things he might have missed, times when Emily's behavior seemed off, times when she was distant or distracted. He had long battled jealousy when it came to Matt, but this was different. This wasn't just envy over Matt's success or charm. This was something far more personal. Scott's heart pounded as he decided to stay quiet, pretending not to notice the message, but inside, he knew he had to find out the truth. The next day, Scott couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Emily had told him she was going to the salon, but doubt gnawed at him. When she left the house, Scott made the decision to follow her. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he tailed her car through town, his mind racing with a mixture of fear and anger. He didn't know what he would find, but deep down, he dreaded what he suspected. When Emily's car pulled into Matt's driveway, Scott's suspicions were confirmed. She had lied to him. The betrayal stung like a physical wound, but he wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. Instead, he parked down the street and walked quietly to the side of Matt's house. He knew this house well. After all, they had spent countless hours here, hanging out as friends. But now, Scott's world was about to change forever. Peering through the window, Scott saw what he had feared the most. There, inside, were Emily and Matt, together, intimately. His heart shattered. In that moment, years of jealousy, resentment, and insecurity came crashing down on him. Everything he had feared, everything he had bottled up for so long was real. The one person he loved more than anything had been taken from him by the one person he had trusted the most. The betrayal was too much to bear. Scott's mind spiraled. This wasn't just about the affair. This was about a lifetime of feeling second best, of always being in Matt's shadow. Matt had always had more than him, and now he had taken Emily too. Rage boiled inside Scott, mixing with his overwhelming sense of hurt and betrayal. He couldn't think straight. All he knew was that he couldn't let this go. Not this time. Scott quietly let himself into the house. He knew Matt kept a spare key hidden under the mat. They had been friends for so long, and Scott had been in and out of Matt's home countless times. But today was different. Today, Scott wasn't just a friend. As he entered the house, his eyes searched for the gun he knew Matt kept in the kitchen cabinet. His hands trembled as he opened the drawer and found it, cold, heavy, and loaded. At that moment, Scott felt like everything in his life had been leading to this point. The jealousy he had always carried, the feelings of inadequacy that had festered for years, all of it had reached its breaking point. Confronting Matt and Emily wasn't just about the affair. It was about all the years of feeling less than Matt, of being overshadowed by him in every way. And now, Matt had taken the one thing that mattered most to him, his wife. When Scott walked into the room where Matt and Emily were, everything fell silent. The confrontation that would forever change the lives of Scott, Emily, and Matt began in a moment of stunned silence. Scott stood at the doorway, gun in hand, his face twisted with pain and rage. Emily and Matt were caught off guard, the shock clear in their eyes. They had no idea Scott had followed Emily, no idea that he had seen them together through the window, or that he had entered the house with Matt's own gun. The air in the room was thick with tension. Emily tried to speak first, stammering, pleading with Scott to put the gun down. Matt, too, tried to calm his best friend, but Scott's mind was already unraveling. The betrayal was too much, and in that moment, all the years of jealousy and resentment he had buried deep inside came rushing to the surface. Scott wasn't just angry about the affair. He was confronting a lifetime of feeling second to Matt. For years, Scott had watched as Matt effortlessly succeeded, charming everyone around him. He had felt inferior, invisible in Matt's shadow, and now, Matt had taken the one thing Scott cherished most: his wife. The affair was the final betrayal, the proof that even in his own marriage, Scott was not enough. His emotions, tightly wound for so long, exploded all at once. Scott shouted, his voice cracking as he unloaded his long-held resentments. He told Matt how he had always felt like the lesser man, less handsome, less successful, less loved. He had been envious of Matt's easy confidence, his charm, the way people were drawn to him. But now, the jealousy was too much to bear. Matt had crossed the line, and Scott couldn't contain his heartbreak and rage any longer. As Scott's emotions spiraled out of control, Emily desperately tried to defuse the situation. She begged Scott to listen, to understand that things could still be fixed. But Scott wasn't listening. His vision blurred with tears, and his mind raced, filled with the betrayal that had shattered his world. The pain of losing Emily to the very man he had always envied became too much, and in a moment of blind rage, he acted without thinking. The sound of the gunshot was deafening. Matt didn't have a chance to react. In an instant, he was on the floor, lifeless. The man who had once been Scott's closest friend was now gone, and there was no taking it back. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Emily screamed, frozen in shock as the reality of what had just happened hit her. Everything she had feared, the lies, the secrecy, the affair, had led to this tragic moment. She ran from the room, her heart pounding, her mind in a blur. Grabbing her phone, she dialed the police, her voice shaking as she explained what had just taken place. But there was no fixing what had been done. The moment Matt fell to the floor, everything had changed forever. Scott, still standing over Matt's body, was numb. The gun felt heavy in his hand, but he barely registered it. His mind was blank, consumed by the devastation of what he had just done. The jealousy, the hurt, the years of feeling not good enough, they had all built up to this point, and now, in the aftermath, there was nothing but emptiness. Matt's murder was not just the end of a friendship. It shattered the lives of everyone involved. Emily, who had once loved Scott, now found herself running from the man she had once trusted with her heart. Scott, who had only ever wanted to be enough for his wife, now faced the consequences of his actions. And Matt, the charismatic, charming friend, was gone, his life cut short by a moment of uncontrolled rage. The police arrived soon after, arresting Scott as he stood in the wreckage of what had once been his world. The small town of Colorado Springs would soon be engulfed in the scandal, and Scott would be charged with murder. But in that room, in those final moments, the truth was simple. Jealousy, pain, and betrayal had pushed Scott to the breaking point, and in one fatal act, everything had been destroyed. The murder sent shockwaves through the small, tight-knit community of Colorado Springs. It wasn't the kind of place where people expected something so tragic, so violent to happen. In this conservative town, where everyone knew each other's business, the news spread fast. People whispered about it in the grocery stores, at church, and over dinner tables. The shocking details, the affair, the jealousy, the murder, became the talk of the town. The incident divided the community. Some people sympathized with Scott, seeing him as a man who had been pushed too far. They talked about how he had always seemed like a decent, quiet guy who loved his wife but struggled with his self-esteem. Others blamed Emily, whispering that if she had been faithful, none of this would have happened. But there were also those who mourned Matt, the man whose life was cut short by betrayal and violence. He had been popular, well-liked, and many couldn't believe that someone as close to him as Scott could commit such a brutal act. Scott's arrest happened quickly. The police found him at the scene, standing in shock over Matt's body. He didn't resist. In fact, he seemed numb, as if the reality of what he had done hadn't fully sunk in. The legal process that followed gripped the town just as much as the murder itself. At his trial, Scott's defense focused on his emotional breakdown in the moment of the killing. His lawyers argued that he had been pushed to his limit, driven to insanity by years of pent-up jealousy and feelings of inadequacy. Scott's testimony was emotional, as he recounted his long-standing envy of Matt, the man who had always seemed to have more success, more charisma, and now, his wife. His defense team suggested that Scott wasn't a cold-blooded killer, but a man overwhelmed by his emotions. They hinted at temporary insanity, arguing that Scott hadn't been in his right mind when he pulled the trigger. But to the prosecution, the case was clear. Scott had committed premeditated murder. He had entered Matt's home, retrieved a gun, and made a decision that ended a life. Whether it was fueled by jealousy or rage, it was still a crime that couldn't be excused. The trial left the town divided once again. Some believed that Scott deserved sympathy, a man driven to desperation by a cruel twist of fate. Others saw him as a dangerous figure whose insecurities had boiled over into something deadly. In the end, Scott was convicted of murder. His punishment marked the tragic end of a story that had begun with friendship and ended with betrayal and death. As for Emily, she was left to face the aftermath of the tragedy on her own. The affair had shattered her marriage, but Matt's death left her utterly alone. She had lost both the man she loved and the man she had betrayed. The guilt weighed heavily on her. She had never intended for things to spiral so far out of control, but now every day was a reminder of what had been lost. The home she had shared with Scott was now filled with silence and the ghosts of what had happened. In the eyes of the community, Emily became a symbol of the affair that had sparked the tragedy. Some blamed her, while others pitied her. But either way, she was left to carry the burden of guilt and grief. The life she had known was gone. Moving forward was difficult, and she faced the challenge of living with the consequences of her choices. The affair may have been born out of loneliness, but its aftermath was something she would carry for the rest of her life. The town of Colorado Springs, once quiet and peaceful, was now forever marked by the murder that had torn apart two families. It was a story that would be told for years to come. A cautionary tale of jealousy, betrayal, and the devastating consequences of unchecked emotions. For those involved, the events of that night were a painful reminder of how quickly life can unravel when love, envy, and rage collide.